Now we're on to page 2 of the resale condominium purchase contract and section 3. The deposits are delivered in trust to someone. In this case, it's usually to the seller's real estate brokerage, and in some cases to the seller's lawyer. And unless you've agreed to in writing, which you could put at the end of this, the deposit goes with the offer, and it might go in upon acceptance of the offer. And then within 3 business days, the check needs to be with the brokerage or the lawyer. Any additional deposits would be delivered as follows. Example, it would be after removal of all conditions. 3.4 discusses if any interest is being paid. 3.5, the deposits are held in trust to be applied against the commission and paid directly out of the trust to the brokerage when the commissions are earned. They're refunded if the offer is not accepted, or it's refunded if the conditions are not satisfied or if the seller fails to perform on the contract, or it's forfeited to the seller if the offer is accepted, all the conditions are satisfied and waived, and the buyer fails to perform. Under 36 or 3.6, the brokerage holding the deposits is directed and authorized to pay the portion exceeding the commission in trust to the seller's lawyer no later than 2 days prior to completion date. And then if there's any disputes under 3.7, if there's a dispute as to the entitlement of it, first of all, the brokerage holding the deposits reviews the circumstances, determines the entitlement, then pays the money out. B, if there's no reasonable conclusion, the brokerage will notify the parties and the monies will be put into a lawyer's trust account. The parties agree to allow the lawyer and the brokerage to deduct from the deposits a reasonable fee and costs incurred for dealing with those deposits. And finally, in D, the brokerage or lawyer acting in good faith underneath this clause shall not be liable to either party for any damages associated with the handling of those deposits, except from the negligence of the brokerage or lawyer. And finally, and a very unusual one would be 3.8, in the event the brokerage holding the trust funds ceases to be licensed in real estate, the buyer and seller agree to allow the trust funds to be transferred over to the other brokerage representing the other party. Now in section 4 on the closing, under 4.1, unless it's agreed to in writing somewhere else, the contract's going to be completed and the purchase price paid in full, and there's vacant possession available at noon on a specific day, month, and year, subject to the rights of any of the existing tenants, if any. Now, if there are tenants in there that are going to be assumed, the word vacant would be stroked out. 4.2, when the buyer obtains possession, the property will be in substantially the same condition as when the contract was accepted. 4.3, there's always a certain amount of items that are normally adjusted on the completion date, like the taxes, levies, utilities, rents, security deposits, homeowners association fees, the monthly condominium contributions. Those will all be adjusted, so at the statement of adjustments, the purchase price, quote, may appear to be slightly higher or slightly lower because of those adjustments taking place. 4.4, the seller or the seller's lawyer will deliver all of these documents, including a real property report that we'll refer to, we'll see in 4.11, and the buyer or the buyer's lawyer, upon reasonable conditions consistent with this contract, will receive that. Then the buyer or the buyer's lawyer reviews the real property report prior to submitting the transfer documents to land titles, and a reasonable period of time before the completion date. That way they can confirm registration of the documents and land titles and obtain the advance of proceeds for any new financing and other value. Now 4.5, if the seller fails to deliver the closing documents according to clause 4.4, then the purchase price and late deposit will be postponed until the buyer has received those closing documents, has had a reasonable period of time to register them, and also to obtain the proceeds for financing. Notwithstanding, if the buyer is also ready to willing and able to close and desires to take possession, then the seller shall give the buyer possession under reasonable terms, which include the payment for late interest only on the amount of the mortgage being obtained by the buyer, if any at all, at the interest rate of the mortgage. Now on the other side, for 4.6, in the circumstances where the seller has complied with the clause, but the buyer's not able to close, the buyer may, but they're certainly not obligated to, they could accept late payment of the purchase price and give the buyer possession with reasonable terms. Now, if the seller agrees in writing to accept late payment under this clause, whether or not possession is granted, the buyer will pay late interest at the prime lending rate plus 3% calculated daily up to the closing day, and the seller is paid in full. The payment needs to be received after noon on any day will be the payment of the next business day. Now 4.7, unless agreed to in writing, the seller is responsible for special assessments that are due and payable on or before the completion date, and the buyer is responsible for any special assessments due and payable after the completion date. So it is critical with condominiums to make sure that if there is any special assessment, that the seller pays it. And obviously, if the special assessment is going to come due and payable after the completion date, you as the buyer would be responsible for that. And at the bottom of the page is a space for your initials on the purchase.